Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 Twisted in the Twilight unit breakdown. This time around we're going to be covering the Wood Elf side of the DLC and obviously focusing more on the multiplayer side of things and what the stats and performance of these units might be, but also giving a bit of a touch to just how useful they may or may not be in campaign. So without further ado, let's dive right in with the flagship unit of this DLC, and that is of course the Sisters of Twilight. Now, these ladies are a bit unique among lords in the sense that they do not have a foot option. Much like Grom, they only get their mounted options, one of which is Gwendolor, the Great Eagle, the other one, Scythenhar, the Forest Dragon. And each of these mounts actually gives the sisters slightly adjusted stats. At baseline, their stats are pretty comparable to a Glade or a Glade Lord. In fact, I do believe they're slightly worse. I believe their melee defense is a bit worse. But on an Eagle mount, they do get Gwendolor's Vantage, which grants them a mild boost to missile damage and, more importantly, some reload skill when they are more than 70 meters away from an opponent. Kind of like Eagle Eye for Way Watchers and Way Stalkers. Lets you do more damage when you're keeping your safe distance. Atop Scythenhar, they do have a conditional Scythenhar's Tenacity, which gives them greater damage output as their HP drops below 50%. And 10% doesn't seem like much, but it does mean your weapon strength goes up to 528, which is not bad. It does definitely give them a bit more damage output as the game progresses if your opponent tries to focus you down. Now, for their abilities, obviously most of their abilities are much akin to a Glade, or most of their combat sets are basically the same as a Glade. You don't have Prae Anathema though, and instead you do have some alternatives. First and foremost, ammo swaps. Their base shot is the Talon of Dawn. This is a armor-piercing single-shot projectile. Now, I should mention when I say single shot, it's not quite true. It's really two shots because each sister fires. And these do 120 damage a pop, and you get two of them, so 240. However, they get an additional 150 or 75 per shot bonus versus large. So it does go up to 195 damage per shot versus large, which is pretty nifty. You end up with close to 400 damage per volley against a large target. This projectile also sunders armor, debuffing them and debuffing your opponent and making them a bit more vulnerable to damage output, whether for themselves to make, say, the Gwendolor especially, who's non-AP, fight a bit better, or otherwise to improve the chances of a unit like Dryads or War Dancers or Wild Riders in the fight they may be stuck in. So definitely nifty from that perspective, and a solid projectile all in all. Definitely much better though at range because it does home, unlike the alternative shot, the Talon of Dusk, and this is essentially bolt through or scatter shot. Once again, you get two volleys of this with each shot, or two shots per volley, each of which does 16 damage, but you get a 40 bonus versus infantry, which is pretty insane. And of course, there are 10 projectiles in each sister's shot, so you get 20 projectiles, each of which does 16 damage. So ultimately, you are looking at 320 damage per volley, and that is without factoring in the bonus versus infantry. So versus infantry, this is an incredibly powerful projectile. You will really mulch enemy infantry formations with what amounts to contemptuous ease. You also get poison, so you can debuff enemies, which can be very, very efficient, and obviously makes it a solid support tool, especially if you're supporting AP units. It can make them much, much more efficient because you don't really need that armor sundering, but getting a bit of poison on an enemy cavalry unit is something very, very valuable. They also, the poison also means that this is probably your better shot option when you're fighting in close quarters, because obviously, much like other flying characters, the Sisters of Twilight do fire into close range, and while the single shot does a little bit less damage if both shots connect, or a little bit more damage if both shots connect, even at close range, oftentimes you will see, due to weird animations and whatnot, the projectiles will miss, and more importantly, you don't get the poison. So up close and personal, the shotgun effect, poisoning your opponent, whatever character you might be fighting, can be very valuable. And so I do find that the Talon of Dusk is actually a better projectile of choice if you're stuck in a close quarters situation. Besides that, the twins do have two abilities that they can pick up, both of which cost a solid amount of gold, but are decent enough. One of which is Conjoined Destiny. This means when they drop below 20% HP, they get a massive heal. However, that heal is not as easy as, say, the Heart of Avalorn for Tyrion. It actually takes 30 seconds to proc, so after dropping below 20%, they have to wait 30 seconds to heal, and This can be an issue. It can mean that the sisters route off the battlefield. It can mean that they route too far away from combat. It can mean that they get finished off by your opponent, or that army lost its procs already and your entire army shatters. There's a lot of cases that can happen where this ability will not save your bacon, even though you were really counting on it to do so. So definitely a bit of a risky ability in some ways, but one that can be very rewarding and allow you to play without a without a life caster if you play a bit more cautiously. Second of all, they do get the Eagle Quiver. This is a magic missile, much akin to the Arrow of Kurnus. Can help you mulch enemy infantry, cavalry, chip away at lords, characters, and obviously snipe out artillery models. It is, however, more expensive, and in my experience, doesn't seem to be much, if any, better. So, kind of a hard to justify option. I think most of the time, if you bring the sisters, you might be bringing them naked abilities, or maybe just bring Conjoined Destiny. I really don't think Eagle Quiver is particularly valuable, but it can definitely give you a bit of burst, especially if you're just trying to snipe out an enemy mage character. It can do rather well for itself. It is also worth mentioning, I should say, with the Sisters of Twilight, the Talon of Dawn, does not, and actually neither does the Talon of Dusk, but neither bow does magic damage, and the Talon of Dawn not doing magic damage can be valuable. Some characters that your opponent might bring do have magic resist. Of course, there is the Chicken, good old Sarthoral, the Everwatcher, and then characters like Marathi, characters such as the Fey Enchanters, of course, all have magic resistance and will be very difficult to snipe down with a traditional Glade arrow. Instead, you can run the Sisters of Twilight, who have a similar homing projectile that actually does more damage, but they don't get shut down by magic resist. I actually think that, for example, against a faction like Bertoni, these guys could be very strong because their scatter shot allows you to break up and kill off peasant bow formations before the fight begins. And with the Talon of Dawn, they can pick off key targets such as casters or Fey Enchantress and that sort of thing from afar before the lines engage. Next up, on the hero roster, we do have the free LC Lord, Drisha, and the other legendary Lord that's coming in alongside this DLC. Now, the Branch Maiden of Woe here does have a pretty fancy color scheme. It's crazy long talons and is raging all over the place right now. Decent combat stats, 80 armor, nothing too terrible. Obviously, the usual physical missile resist combo that you expect of trees. We've already looked at some of her abilities in the recent Tree Rush video, but she is, of course, a Shadows caster with all that entails. She does get the usual Blessing of the Ancients, like all Wood Elf casters do. Fang of Teleroth is her unique item. It debuffs enemy recharge time by 15 seconds every time she casts. So if you're focusing on Drisha as your caster and you've brought, say, 3 of their cheaper abilities like the now nerfed Penumbral Pendulum, Melkot's Miasma, and Enfeebling Foe, she can cycle through that and stall your opponent's spells for quite a while. Her other ability is Rouse to Wrath, which summons a unit of Dryads atop your opponent. Definitely nifty for disrupting backlines and harassing. This is, in fact, her unique campaign Dryads, Malevolent Dryads, and these have Frenzy, so they're actually more damaging than normal Dryads. And you can drop it in a main backline, use it to overrun archers or missile units, or otherwise disrupt your opponent and perhaps help break through a front line, since Dryads are not terrible at butchering light infantry. But I do think Drisha is going to have a niche in sort of Vanguard builds, and will allow you to bring a budget Lord option that you couldn't otherwise, since she is an all-in-one caster and fighter, reasonably tanky, and she does have the benefit of Fanatical Resolve, which is her final trait or ability. This is, in fact, something that's just baked into her kit. Every 25% of HP you lose, you get 5 more melee attack and weapon damage for all units around her. So especially supporting Dryads or Treekin in a Vanguard, this is excellent. For supporting Treemen who don't have the best melee attack, this is a really good buff. And even if it comes down to late game and you are forced to fight your opponent with your darn archers in melee and you're using your Way Watchers and Deepwood Scouts to clean up, the fact that you are able to soup them up by a decent amount there can be valuable. So I do think Drisha's Fanatical Resolve will definitely be a good reason to bring her, especially supporting blobs that may involve some of these other blobber support characters like the Glade Captain. Going along to the Lord option that is coming with the DLC, the Spellweaver. And the Spellweaver is a caster Lord option. She comes in with the usual 3 Wood Elf lores of Beasts, Shadows, and Life magic. Also gets dark and high magic, reflecting the duality of the Wood Elves. In tabletop, in fact, they had access to all 8 lores of magic and dark and light and high. So I'm a little disappointed we're not seeing light We're not seeing fire, we're not seeing death or any of those lores. It's a little unfortunate, but you know what? At least we were getting high and dark magic, so that does shake things up a little. They actually get a unique lore passive for dark as well as high magic. With dark, they get the Wrath of the Wood, which actually boosts missile damage for a few seconds rather than the usual armor debuff. And if you bring high magic, in fact, we can see it here on Ariel, you get Ancient's Protection. So it grants 10% physical resist for 10 seconds rather than the usual Shield of Sapphire granting ward save. So a little bit different there, depending on which lore you pick. Otherwise, they're a pretty terrible combatant. Their only options are Stag, Great Stag, and Stag, Unicorn, and or not Stag. Well, I'm completely derping it here, but Horse, Unicorn, and Eagle. Now, I think in most cases you're probably going to bring these guys super cheap and go on foot or horse, or maybe bring a Great Eagle. Great Eagle will give her some ability, a little bit of extra fighting power, and help her position to utilize her magic most effectively. She does get the Opal Amulet to protect herself, as well as Loic's Blessing, which allows her to stealth a group of allies, which is pretty neat. I think there's going to be some cheesy, gimmicky builds taking advantage of this in the future, because being able to stock some units and get them into your opponent's backline is going to be a whole lot of fun, especially with the high mobility Wood Elves have. Having 24 seconds of stealth is actually pretty amazing. Given that most of your cap sits at 80 to 95 speed, they could take advantage of that and really get into your opponent's backline, jump on them before they know what's going on. Arcane Conduit does give her some extra winds of magic. You do also have Blessing of the Ancients, so if you're playing more static or if you're on a forest map, you can take advantage of that. And the Channeling Staff, which is kind of useless, but if you want to spam spells, I guess it can have some value at reducing your ability cooldown. Also helps you drop Loic's Blessing a little faster if you really want to. But I don't think you're really going to be bringing either of her items, because ultimately you're probably going to want to bring your Spellcaster cheap and cheerful. Moving on into the hero slot, there are 2 heroes coming out alongside this DLC, or one of which is coming in the DLC, and that's Ariel, of course. The Glade Captain coming out alongside it, and she is a fighting character, somewhere between a High Elf Noble and a High Elf Handmaiden. Her bow, she's armed with a bow much similar to a Waystalker or a Glady. Nothing too fancy, nothing to write home about there, really. But it's really her melee prowess as well as her support abilities that I think are going to define her. So even her stats here, they're decent. They're actually not any better than a Waystalker's, which is kind of hilarious. So in combat, she's, especially on a foot, she's not really going to be much better than a Waystalker, especially if you're fighting a foot character, because the bonus first large won't matter. However, you do get a bonus first large, which is very, very nice. And she can be mounted on a Eagle, which allows you to bring a triple Eagle with bow build. You can snipe your opponent from afar and be cackling like mad, like an absolute scumbag with 3 Eagles, just chipping your opponent down. And she can also be brought on a Great Stag, which buffs physical resist to 20%. The Great Stag mount is now also accessible to Glade Lords. Doesn't really buff your stats by a huge amount, gives you a little bit more weapon strength and charge bonus on all those characters. The main benefit is that you get physical resist, which does make them a bit beefier. Now, the main benefit, though, I think, of the Glade Captain is going to be her blob support. She gets the Dance of Loic as well as the Horn of Isha, both of which buff melee attack and defense by 5. So, +5/+5, definitely not bad, and it means that if you're fighting alongside your cavalry, or maybe fighting alongside a tree blob, maybe with Dryshot in tow, you can buff your troops by a massive amount, make them fight a hell of a lot better, while simultaneously giving them a hefty bit of AP anti-large in the mix, and help chip your opponent down pretty efficiently. Besides that, she does have the Potion of Strength and Deadly Onslaught, so in a burst, the Glade Captain, if fully kitted out, can do some obscene amounts of damage, far more than 360 base weapon strength would imply. Or I should say 330. It's 360 on the Great Stag. Of course, just like the High Elf Noble, she does lose AP on an Eagle, so do be aware of that. But I definitely think this is going to be a valuable character, good for kiting, but good for some crazy, abusive flying strats, and just good at helping beef up the Bretonnians against their greatest nemesis, mobs of Heavy Cav. Next up, we do have Ariel. Now, this is a caster hero, and she's in some ways kind of like Sir Throil. She is, in fact, large, unlike a lot of other foot casters, which is a little interesting. Just by appearance, it's a little hard to gauge. I guess she is rather big. She is definitely bigger than a character on a mount, but keep in mind she's floating above the ground. She is kind of large, so that's going to make her a bit vulnerable. In my experience, she does tend to get knocked over a lot. So unlike Sartorial, she doesn't seem to have the mass or the staying power to just kind of plow through formations or escape troublesome situations with ease. She definitely gets bowled over quite a bit. However, she does get a cool mixed lore of magic and some insane abilities, though of course that comes at a cost. Combat stats, as you can see, are decent overall. You get missile resist, physical resist, which does offset the low HP. Good, a very high HP pool of almost 5,000, and she is unbreakable, so much like Orion, you do got to kill her to the very last HP, and that can be a problem for some factions, especially when she's causing fear and terror that whole time. For passives, she gets the Lore of Life, High, and Dark passives, which are neat. Greater Arcane Conduit for that Winds of Magic, and then a few spells cherry-picked from every lore. From Life, she gets Shield of Thorns as well as Dwellers Below. All in all, solid spells there. Not a huge fan of Dwellers Below nowadays. It can be useful for breaking up blobs, but probably not going to be seeing that very often. Shield of Thorns, however, very good for buffing Wood Elf units. Apotheosis, of course, great heal. Tempest, which is going to make your opponent have to watch out on the Ariel front. And then we do have both Soul Stealer and Word of Pain. So some of the best spells from Lore of High Magic and Dark Magic coming over. And with Greater Arcane Conduit to spam them, she's going to be an absolute menace. For her actual abilities, she gets Dart of Doom, which is a magic missile that does a little bit of damage, but more importantly, debuffs enemy weapon strength by 25%. And this can help you. If you're fighting, say, Grail Knights with your Stags, which is not an ideal situation for your Stags, you can make those Grail Knights punch a lot weaker. You can debuff a key enemy target that you're trying to duel with a character. Make them much more susceptible to damage. That sort of thing. So the Dart definitely has an application there, though it is very expensive, being a legendary item. She also gets Berry Wine, which is essentially a single target regrowth. It's free of Winds of Magic. It takes... It lasts for 14 seconds once it's casted. Really, really strong. Once again, though, these are all legendary items. They do cost a lot. And the Acorn of the Oak of Ages, basically an armor-piercing Awakening of the Wood. Good for blob busting. Still applies that nifty slow. Just do be aware that all these items are legendary, so while they are very powerful, they are very expensive, and Ariel can quickly put a massive dent in your already small budget as Wood Elves with her high cost. But certainly a solid support caster. I think we're going to see a good amount of her with her lineup of very solid abilities as well as good spells selection, especially Apotheosis, Shield of Thorns, Tempest, and Soul Stealer. Depending on the matchup you're in, you can really streamline her build to bring the best of the best options you possibly have onto the table. Now from there, we are moving on to the unit selection. And first and foremost, we got the Regiment Renown Dryads, the Wraiths of the Frozen Heart. These ladies are basically normal Dryads, vetted up to 9, with Frenzy as well as Frostbite atop that. For only 750 gold, which is only 200 more than normal Dryads, I think they're almost a steal. They're rather cheap and pretty efficient for that. Obviously not going to be beating down something like Chaos Warriors with these ladies, but they can certainly trade rather well for their cost, with especially squishier infantry, and more importantly, that Frostbite lets you control enemy cavalry. If you put them down alongside some Zoets, they can prevent your opponent from cycle charging in and out of combat easily, and prevent your opponent from escaping you with Heavy Cav. Prevent Heavy Cav from plowing through with 43 speed, which is what all Dryads were buffed to. They can actually stay on top of a Cav unit that's been slowed that much, especially a unit like Empire Knights, Reiksguard, or even slightly faster cavalry like Grail Knights and Knights of the Realm and Demigryph Knights. They can really be snared down by Wraiths of the Frozen Heart and slowed into a position where then they can be beaten down by Zoets or Great Stag Knights or units like that. I could actually see these units being brought even when they're supporting an Eternal Guard line just for that Frostbite, because it's just such a powerful debuff. Next up, the Blade Singers. These somewhat reskinned War Dancers. Got a nice change on their hairdo and some glowy knives now. But these ladies do have some pretty obscene combat stats. 6,300 HP rather than 5,100 of normal War Dancers. Rather competitive combat stats of 44-42 with an 8 bonus versus infantry, which does soup up that kind of lackluster 36 weapon strength, a decent amount. Good leadership, physical resist, which means that against opponents hitting with physical damage, these ladies actually have close to 8,000 HP in value. It means they basically have comparable survivability to something like Chosen or Temple Guard if your opponent is just slinging AP at them. Obviously, not against like non-AP units, not against cavalry or something like that, but and of course not against magic damage. But it doesn't mean that their survivability is deceptively low. They also do have a dance just like all the other War Dancer dances. Now these have in fact been reworked this patch, and rather than being an ability you trigger, they are now simply a stance you can swap. It's just like Lance Formation for Bretonnians. You're either running Whirling Death for the for Blade Singers, or you're running your vanilla mode. Now with the Whirling Death you get a massive spike to non-AP damage, makes them essentially uber War Dancers, and with their magic damage, they will mow through a lot of enemy troops. Units like Berserkers or Skin Wolves. I think that in the Norscan matchup, these ladies are actually going to be pretty nasty, just swapping over to Whirling Death mode and being very capable of staying on top of faster units and just mulching through troops that rely on physical resist over armor with their pretty obscene stats. And weapon strength that spikes up into the 50s when you pop Whirling Death. As mentioned, this will be applying to other War Dancers as well, so now you can choose your stance however you please, which is nice. That said, I think the Blade Singers are definitely going to be a bit niche. Magic damage means they're not ideal against dwarves if you don't bring them some good support like Zoets, which are not good against dwarves, or Branch Wraith with the other Trickster's Shard. And I think in most matchups they're going to be at very high risk for heavy cav, which is still going to be a competitive choice against Wood Elves. So I don't think we'll see these ladies often, but when we do, they will perform well, I think. And especially if you're, they will perform especially well if you're expecting some units that rely on physical resist. I should mention that they actually beat, I believe, all great weapon units in a 1v1. Now, obviously, this is kind of pointless because Wood Elves, you're not worried about great weapon units, you're worried about shielded units. But it does mean that it gives the Wood Elves some staying power if you're fighting a faction that maybe bring some unshielded troops, something like Berserkers, something along those lines. And it's also worth noting that you can, of course, synergize these ladies alongside Zoets. Zoets will remove enemy magic resist if they have any, and more importantly, they can actually provide them with Flesh to Stone, so that'll make them much tankier than they would be on paper. Next up, free LC edition, the Glade Riders with Spears. These guys are basically souped up Dark Riders. There isn't much else to say for them. They of course got Vanguard, they've got crazy good speed. Passable combat stats, though not as high as I would have liked. I would have liked these guys to be a smidge pricier and better in combat, but alas, can't have it all. They do have bronze shields, despite having bigger shields than or comparable shields. I actually think they're bigger shields than the Stag Knights, which is kind of hilarious, and especially when you compare it to the size of the horse they're riding on. You'd think this should be a silver shield, but can't have it all, I guess. It does give the Wood Elves something they've been missing for a while: cheap mass and a cheap way to disrupt backlines, shut down artillery, that sort of thing. 550 gold means they're not absolutely dirt cheap, but it does mean they can be very efficient and should be good for running off units like Hounds before you have to invest in Wild Riders, or throw your expensive missile cav into melee to shut down backline harass from dogs or light cav your opponents. Now you can just throw in a unit of 550 gold Glade Riders and shut them down on the cheap, which is really, really nice. Since 40 charge bonus means they'll turn a unit like dogs into mincemeat. Moving onward, we do have the Great Stags and their Regiment Renown, the Lost Sylvan Knights. These guys are, well, pretty brutal. Their combat stats might not seem the greatest, but they do have 90 speed on what's essentially a heavy cav. 60 armor is no longer in a sort of terrible state. Not amazing for 1500 gold, but very, very good. Silver shields, 66 weapon strength. Keep in mind, they get Frenzy on top of this. 70 charge bonus, physical resist, fear, Vanguard. Just a crazy strong unit, when one that synergizes very nicely with healing. However, do be aware that in the testing I've done, they seem to underperform quite heavily against lance-armed cav, against 45 model lance cap. Not entirely sure why that is. I think some of it comes down to their awkward charges. The Stag Knights tend to, despite having a great charge bonus, they tend to have some very awkward charge animations and connections, and you often won't get all your Stag Knights in a fight immediately, which sucks, and makes them, in my opinion, underperform quite heavily in those fights. But if you use them as a countercharge unit to support your infantry, if you use them against factions that don't necessarily have top tier lance cap, like for example Empire, I think they can be very respectable. And obviously they can be used against factions like dwarves, or factions like that, to disrupt backlines and just harry your opponent and take advantage of that monstrous 66 weapon strength to really do some major hurt. And of course they can synergize very nicely with Flesh to Stone. So if you've got Zoets or Life Singer on the field, you can give these bad boys 120 armor for a long period of time and they will become murder machines. Now the Regiment Renown lost Sylvan Knights, 2,000 gold worth of ethereal unit, a little less HP than their vanilla brethren, and of course less armor in exchange for terror, and physical resist, and rank 9 stats. Pretty bonkers. It is worth mentioning, I think, that these guys are not in fact unbreakable, and they do not crumble, so it's kind of hilarious. I do believe they're the only ethereal unit that doesn't either crumble or be unbreakable. Which I personally find kind of amusing. However, they're going to be a very monstrous and difficult unit to remove. Unless you have magic damage. If you have magic damage, you should be able to kill them rather quickly. Obviously, the lack of armor hurts them, and the reliance on physical resist there is definitely going to be inadequate. Though, that said, they're not as vulnerable as other ethereal units to magic damage. They do still have very solid HP pools, and they do have respectable combat stats, so they will hold out for an okay amount, even if you're faced with, say, Grail Knights. Though, certainly it's not where you want them to be at all, and it will certainly not be cost efficient. They will hold much better than you would expect. More importantly, though, I think if you're fighting a faction, especially a faction that relies on a lot of magic range damage, where you can get into the backline and disrupt quickly, the Lost Sylvan Knights, I think, will be excellent. They're going to be very hard to shut down. For a faction like Vampire Coast, who doesn't have much access to magic damage on his roster, besides its own ethereal units, which these guys will demolish, something like Syrenes are not going to hold at all. I think these guys can be very, very solid and be an absolute menace to your opponents. Definitely excited to see them, though I do fear they could be a bit abusive and simultaneously lackluster in the majority of matchups. Moving along, we do reach the Zoets, and this is the final unit for the DLC. Basically, they're watered down Dragon Ogres. They are simply inferior to Dragon Ogres across the board. Much lower HP, 1,000 less HP, lower combat stats, lower weapon strength. But they do get Bound Magic. You get Bound Flesh to Stone and Bound Earthblood. This means that they can use this on themselves. So you can give yourself 600 worth of healing. You can give yourself plus 60 armor for up to 88 seconds if you spam it on yourself. So very, very solid. You can buff up your friendly units. You can buff up great Stag Knights. You can buff up Wood Elf Infantry to hold much better. And at the same time, these guys are applying magic damage. They do have Dampen, so they reduce enemy magic resistance. So if you're fighting, say, Knights of the Blazing Sun, that's amazing. You bring them down to size. If you're fighting Grail Knights, you're negating their magic attacks, and you can negate a lot of their damage with armor buffs. If you're fighting Dragon Princes, you can negate that armor and the physical resist. So just a very good unit. I think hard counter heavy cav, even if it's not as efficient as Dragon Ogres, I think these guys will really, really perform quite well. The Regiment Renown is basically just these guys, but better stats and with regrowth tacked on instead of Earthblood, and that of course allows you to soup up one unit. I'm not sure you'll see the Regiment Renown all that often because you are paying 350 more gold for these guys, and you lose Earthblood, so you're actually not able to support Blob as much. You support a single unit for a regrowth. So not entirely sure they're actually all that valuable. Obviously rank 9 stats on the cheap are nice, but they're not really, I don't think they're going to be an overpowered, I should say, Regiment Renown. I think they're going to be pretty fairly priced there. But I think in a lot of matchups where you see a lot of heavy cav hit the field, you're going to see these bad boys in mass looking to lay the crump down on units like Grails and units like Dragon Princes and stuff like that. And they do have some, despite the fact that they are Dragon Ogre reskins, they do have some pretty nifty animations, some neat little animations, little visual effects there, little puffs of magic and all that. So that's pretty neat. Definitely excited to see the Zoets in action. So going over the comp here, I do think the Wood Elves are basically getting a lot of coverage against their biggest weaknesses. A lot of anti-large and AP to deal with heavy cavalry that you see in mass against Wood Elves. Some snares to help slow that cavalry down. And unfortunately some blob support with Drisha as well as the Glade Captains, though nothing too egregious, I think, since you are giving up, say, a tanky lord like Durthu to make it happen. Sisters of Twilight, I do think will be a bit of a niche pick. Good for kiting, good for harass, but not something you want in sustained combat. Definitely lacking Crave Anathrema is going to make them, is going to prevent them from becoming, say, a staple lord, I think, like the Glady. Ariel, I think, is very respectable, just very expensive. So I don't think, so despite her amazing spell kit, I don't think you'll see her that often. It's just going to be too pricey to bring her consistently. And the one awkward unit, I think, for this patch is Blade Singers. They're obviously very strong if they get their ideal matchup, but their ideal matchup is basically never going to happen since nobody brings halberds and great weapons against Wood Elves. But that said, I could see them having a use in some certain matchups like Norska, where I really do think that the Rolling Death stance is going to be excellent against the massive low armor troops Norska tends to spam against you. I can see them being useful. Perhaps if you can protect them, bring like 1 or 2 of these ladies into matchup, and then just protecting them with everything else, using them as a core unit to just win the front line could be very useful. Maybe against a faction like Empire or something, you could use these guys to clean up all the state troops essentially, while the rest of your army just protects them and deals with other threats. But certainly not a terrible unit, but I think a very, very niche unit, and one that, unlike what a lot of people were hoping, these guys would be counter to dwarves. I don't think they're going to be doing that at all. Magic resist is just going to screw them there. But definitely a cool unit to see. Definitely, for me, it's a more exciting shift to the Wood Elf meta, I think, than the Skaven part of the DLC. I think this is going to give the Wood Elves options they really didn't have before. It's going to help break the Waywatcher blob meta that's kind of developed, unfortunately, because Waywatchers were just the Wood Elves crush for every problem. So it's going to be exciting to see that shifted and see a selection of heavier cavalry units and close quarters troops that really highlight the Wood Elves' prowess as a glass cannon faction. Having Blade Singers as what War Dancers should have been is really nice. Having a heavy AP cav is going to be nice. So definitely excited to see these units in action and see how you can make the most of them. As usual, guys, leave me your thoughts and opinions down below. I will respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.